Chris Clark is a retired police intelligence officer turned author who's researching a book about the life and crimes of Angus Sinclair and Gordon Hamilton, who died in 1996.
Angus Sinclair was a travelling criminal. On one occasion he travelled over 100 miles to the fishing area that he and his brother-in-law went to, and crossed several police boundaries. And there wasn't the mechanism in those days to target, and so where the deposition site was completely different from the abduction area, different police forces, and this was part of the problem. Also, the forensic ability in those days was quite poor, and the exhibits that were retained were not handled properly, and in many cases were lost.
It says on there, to the Chief Superintendent.
Peter MacLeod was a detective in Strathclyde Police Intelligence Bureau in 2001, where he was tasked with examining unsolved murders. At the time, Angus Sinclair was in prison for the rape and sexual assault of 11 children aged 6 to 14. He was due to stand trial and would be convicted for the 1978 murder of 17-year-old Mary Gallagher in Glasgow. MacLeod wrote this document, a briefing paper, in which he suggested Sinclair should be investigated for the 1977 murders of Anna Kenny, Hilda Macaulay and Agnes Cooney. All three women had been abducted and killed after nights out in the Glasgow area. To this day, these murders remain unsolved. Sinclair killed Helen Scott and Christine Eadie in October 1977. The young women were abducted, bound, raped and killed. Then there is the death of teenage mother Leslie Perry, whose body was found in Woodland in Lanarkshire in July 1977. An official inquiry recorded an open verdict, but her family remained convinced she was murdered. Peter MacLeod is certain that Sinclair claimed many more lives than the 4 he was convicted of.
I would say quite a lot of murders, up to maybe 14, I would say, possibly, and maybe more.
Well, that's
throughout Scotland.
That's a dramatic figure.
It is, yes. But there's a lot of these crimes have very similar MOs. That certainly would indicate it was Angus Sinclair.
However, this is not simply a disturbing story about Sinclair allegedly getting away with murders. A report raises questions about alleged miscarriages of justice. These, we are told, allowed Sinclair to continue his killing spree. In June 1977, Frances Barker was abducted in Glasgow, raped and murdered. Her body was dumped in Lanarkshire. Lorry driver Thomas Ross Young was a serial sex offender who was found guilty of murdering Frances and died in prison 6 years ago, still protesting his innocence. To many, Sinclair was the real killer.
Thomas Ross Young was convicted of the June 1997 murder of Frances Barker, but you have a different theory. What is that?
Frances Barker lived about a quarter of a mile away from Sinclair's mother, and Sinclair, even though he was married at the time, would very often stay with his mother, and during periods when he'd be separate from his wife, he would go and live with his mother. So he had plenty of opportunity to maybe have seen Frances Barker previously on the street. She was taken to a wooded area in Glenboy. Her body was found a few weeks later. She'd been strangled with items of her own clothing, gagged, and her wrists tied behind her back.
When you look at Frances Barker's murder in relation to the other ladies who met the fate the same year, it's identical in the way Frances was abducted and where her deposition was and the manner in which she was left. And also there was a very close involvement with Sinclair's mother to the victim's address.
When Peter MacLeod wrote this memo, he expected that it would be acted upon. Instead, he says, there was no appetite to do so, that it was effectively buried, and that senior officers then attempted to force him out of his job. But why?
I could only surmise.
What do you surmise?
My surmise, it was to protect certain crimes where people have been wrongly convicted and that they wouldn't come to light as a result of that being discovered.
So this is a fairly serious point. Are you accusing senior officers of blocking further investigation, resulting in a miscarriage of justice?
Well, I can see no other explanation for it.
There was